Adrian Buchanan had dreamed of owning a serene property with a secluded swimming area for as long as he could remember. After years of overtime shifts and strict budgeting, he finally saved enough to purchase a picturesque home in Sandpiper Springs, a community famed for its leafy streets and sun-kissed afternoons. His favorite feature was undoubtedly the private lagoon-style pool, tucked behind high hedges and lush palm trees, a secret oasis from the hectic pace of everyday life. Not long after settling in, Adrian encountered an unexpected hurdle: his neighbor, Mara Sullivan. Mara wasted little time making her presence known. While friendly at first glance, waving over fences, offering polite nods, she swiftly developed a habit of straying onto Adrian's property. At first, Adrian dismissed it as mere curiosity. Maybe she mistook the pool for a shared amenity. However, as days passed, he found towels draped over his patio chairs and empty soda cans floating in the shallow end. Eventually, he bumped into Mara one afternoon as she lounged by the pool, her feet dipped in the cool water. She had a confident smile, the kind that suggested she felt entirely within her rights to be there. Adrian carefully explained that he valued his privacy and had saved for years to afford this retreat. Mara, however, waved off his concerns, remarking that the pool felt like a neighborhood benefit. When Adrian tried to insist otherwise, she countered that he was being stingy about something the community deserved to enjoy. Confused and slightly unnerved, Adrian attempted to maintain civility. He didn't want to sour relations with a neighbor, especially in a place he hoped would be his forever home. He politely asked her not to use the pool without permission and assumed that would resolve the issue. Yet the next morning, he discovered fresh footprints on the damp tiles and a half-empty bottle of sunscreen that wasn't his. Realizing the problem wasn't going away, he gently confronted Mara again. This time, her response was sharper. She insinuated Adrian was being selfish, accusing him of enjoying exclusive rights to something that should be communal. Baffled, he repeated his stance that the pool was on his private property, and asked her to respect that boundary. Despite his calm tone, Mara grew defensive, stating she had every right to enjoy the water if the gate was unlocked. Afterward, Adrian felt a knot of anxiety settle in his stomach. He'd purchased this home to find peace, not to engage in battles over property lines. Yet here he was, spending more time fretting about unwelcome guests than basking in the tranquil escape he'd worked so hard to create. Deep down, he feared Mara's disregard for his boundaries was just the beginning. Still determined to handle matters politely, Adrian resolved to reinforce his stance. If Mara persisted, he'd consider adding more security, something he'd hoped wouldn't be necessary. Little did he know just how far Mara would go to assert her so-called entitlement, placing them on a collision course that would ultimately rock their quiet neighborhood. Contrary to Adrian Buchanan's hope that a second polite conversation would solve the issue, Mara Sullivan doubled down on her claim to his property's secluded swimming area. Mere days after he calmly explained the pool was private, Adrian spotted her again, this time in a vibrant swimsuit, laughing with a friend while wading in the shallow end. He approached cautiously, keen to avoid a scene. When Mara caught sight of him, she offered a dismissive wave. "Don't be so uptight," she chided. "We're just cooling off. It's sweltering out here." Adrian drew a sharp breath, reminding himself to remain polite. "Mara," he said, "I asked you not to use the pool without permission. You don't live here. This is my personal space." She raised an eyebrow. "Shouldn't neighbors share what they have? You have more than enough room, so why can't we all benefit? My cousin grew up around here, and she said people used to do that all the time, no fuss about it." The sheer audacity took Adrian by surprise. He held firm, explaining again that he'd purchased the home precisely for its privacy and had never intended to open it up for public use. Even so, his words seemed to bounce off Mara's sense of entitlement. Her friend looked on with an uncomfortable expression, muttering that maybe they should leave. But Mara wasn't budging. She kept insisting that Adrian was hoarding a resource and acting selfishly. Eventually, the friend did gather her things and exit the pool, clearly embarrassed by the standoff. Mara lingered, as if hoping to wear Adrian down through sheer stubbornness. He resisted the temptation to lose his temper, repeating his request one final time before heading inside. "I'll give her time," he thought. "Surely she'll get bored and go home." Later that evening, Adrian emerged to find the pool empty but littered with signs of a small get-together: empty cups, snack wrappers, and a few damp towels. None were his. Furious, he realized Mara must have stayed longer, perhaps inviting more people once he'd gone indoors. Fed up, he decided enough was enough. The next morning, Adrian began researching solutions. He decided the most immediate step was to install a sturdy lock on the gate leading to his backyard. Granted, he'd left it unlocked for convenience, he enjoyed slipping in and out without fumbling for keys. But with Mara's blatant disregard for boundaries, that convenience was no longer feasible. While scouring home improvement websites, he also discovered security camera systems with motion detection alerts. Though it felt extreme, he reasoned it might be vital to have documented evidence if Mara, or anyone else, chose to trespass again. He placed an online order for a camera kit, plus a robust locking mechanism that required a unique key code. With that in place, only he or a trusted guest could gain entry. Before the supplies arrived, Adrian tried one last diplomatic move. He called Mara's listed phone number. She didn't pick up, so he left a voicemail explaining that he intended to lock the pool area and hoped she would respect his decision. No response came. On the contrary, he caught a fleeting glimpse of her peering from her window with a smirk as he carried the new lock and camera devices to his garage. Over the course of an afternoon, Adrian painstakingly installed the lock on the pool gate. He tested it multiple times, ensuring it latched securely and the code panel worked correctly. Then he mounted two small cameras, one facing the gate, the other overlooking the pool itself, linking them to an app on his phone that would ping him whenever movement was detected. It felt unsettling to turn his little oasis into a monitored zone, but he couldn't see another way. If Mara insisted on acting like the pool was communal property, then he had to protect what was rightfully his. That evening, a notification buzzed on Adrian's phone: the gate camera had detected movement. Heart pounding, he checked the live feed. Sure enough, Mara was at the gate, pressing the lock's keypad with an irritated scowl. When the gate refused to open, she rattled it angrily. The camera's audio picked up her muttering curses under her breath. Eventually, she stormed off, but not without yelling something about petty boundaries over the fence. Relief and dread swirled together in Adrian's mind. The lock had worked, preventing her from strolling in at will, but at what cost? He suspected Mara's frustration wouldn't end there. She appeared to be the type who thrived on confrontation. Still, as he watched her retreat, he felt a flicker of victory. Perhaps she'd move on and accept that his pool was off limits. He couldn't deny a small sense of triumph, albeit tinged with apprehension about what her next move might be. In the days ahead, Adrian stayed vigilant. His phone alerts remained quiet for a while, and no sign of trespassers appeared around the gate. Maybe, just maybe, he thought, this was the last straw for Mara. However, as he would soon learn, her drive to assert control wasn't so easily quelled. Tensions between them simmered, ready to boil over at the slightest provocation, setting the stage for an even more dramatic showdown to come. The newly installed lock and security cameras offered Adrian Buchanan a sense of relief, at least for a short while. Every evening, he'd review the camera footage on his phone, verifying that no unauthorized visits took place. He rejoiced in the quiet. After weeks of enduring Mara Sullivan's blatant trespassing, it was a welcome change. Then one Sunday morning, the calm was shattered. Adrian woke to a piercing clanging sound echoing from his backyard. He leaped out of bed, heart pounding, and checked the live camera feed. Sure enough, Mara stood at the gate, wielding a small crowbar. She struck the lock repeatedly, her face twisted in determination. With adrenaline surging, Adrian rushed outside. "Mara, what do you think you're doing?" he demanded. The clanging ceased, and she turned to face him, her expression brimming with outrage. "You're not going to get away with barring me from what I deserve," she hissed. He couldn't believe her audacity. The lock was newly installed, and here she was attempting to break it in broad daylight. Any notion that she might give up politely had vanished. "You deserve?" Adrian echoed, disbelief coloring his voice. "It's my property. You have no right to force your way in." Mara slammed the crowbar against the fence post, making a metallic clang that reverberated in the still morning air. "I have every right," she insisted. "Your place was always meant to be shared. These neighborhoods were built with the spirit of community. You're the outsider, hoarding your fancy pool like a miser." Her entitlement stunned him, rendering him speechless. She ranted on, claiming that she'd grown up in the area, that her grandparents once owned multiple plots nearby, and that she wasn't about to let some new money resident dictate what was communal and what wasn't. Realizing the situation could escalate, Adrian tried to remain composed. "Mara, put down the crowbar and step away," he warned. "I'll call the police if you keep this up. I have everything recorded on camera." Instead of calming down, Mara dialed her own phone. To Adrian's astonishment, she began telling someone, likely emergency services, that the homeowner is threatening me with violence. Shocked, Adrian tried to interject, but she spoke over him. "He's brandishing a weapon," she lied, adding details that painted her as the victim. Moments later, she ended the call with a self-satisfied smirk. "Now we'll see who's in trouble," she said, tossing the crowbar onto his lawn with a clang. "They'll be here soon." Adrian stood rooted in place, anger and fear mingling in his stomach. He'd never dealt with someone so brazenly willing to twist the truth. He glanced at his phone, verifying the cameras were still rolling. At least he had evidence. "Fine," he replied, voice shaky. "I'll wait for them to come." Within minutes, a police cruiser pulled up. 2 officers stepped out, scanning the scene. Mara instantly launched into her fabricated story. Adrian had allegedly threatened her with harm when she merely wanted to talk. He was apparently out of control, and she feared for her safety. One officer turned to Adrian, prepared to question him sternly. But before the situation could spiral, Adrian calmly reached into his pocket. "Officer, I have footage from my security cameras," he said. "You can see everything for yourself, her attempt to break the lock and her false call." The mention of video evidence shifted the officer's demeanor. "Let's have a look," one said. They followed Adrian to his living room, where he cast the recorded footage onto a TV screen. The video showed Mara hammering at the lock, then making her bogus emergency call, crowbar in hand. Crucially, there was no sign of Adrian threatening her or holding a weapon. Returning to the yard, the officers confronted Mara with the evidence. Her face reddened, and she stumbled over her words, muttering about how the camera footage was taken out of context. Yet, the facts were undeniable. She had lied about the threat, and she had clearly been the aggressor, attempting to break onto his property. One officer shook his head, warning Mara that filing a false report was a serious offense. They took her statement, but they also advised her that she could face charges if this behavior continued. Stung, Mara glared at Adrian. "You'll regret this," she whispered vehemently before the officers escorted her off his lawn. Relief washed over Adrian. In that moment, he appreciated the investment he'd made in cameras more than ever. Had he not installed them, he might have been in serious trouble. Instead, the truth prevailed. Yet, he recognized that Mara wasn't finished. Her parting words rang in his ears like a warning bell. Over the following days, rumors about the incident spread around the neighborhood. Some neighbors approached Adrian sympathetically, shaken by the story of Mara's outburst. A few even admitted that they'd once had minor disputes with her but never imagined she'd go this far. Still, there were those who shrugged off the situation, calling it a misunderstanding or labeling Adrian as overreacting. It reminded him how easily public perception could shift, especially when confronted with a determined personality like Mara's. Despite the brief lull in direct confrontations, a dark undercurrent of tension loomed. Adrian couldn't shake the feeling that Mara would escalate her tactics. Each day, he triple-checked the lock, scanned the camera feeds, and kept an eye on local forums for any sign of a coordinated campaign against him. He took solace in the fact that the police had warned her about future trespassing, yet in the back of his mind, he suspected she wouldn't back down so easily. He also noticed a disturbing pattern. The more he learned about Mara's background, her family's long-standing presence in the community, her unwavering sense of entitlement, the more he realized that there might be something deeper fueling her hostility. Perhaps it wasn't just about a pool. Maybe, for her, it was about preserving an illusion of power or status that she felt threatened by an outsider like Adrian. Regardless of her motivations, Adrian stood firm. He refused to let fear drive him from the home he'd worked so hard to acquire. If Mara wanted a battle of wills, he'd protect himself with facts, footage, and the law. Unbeknownst to him, he was on the cusp of uncovering a hidden layer of Mara's history, a discovery that would shine a stark light on her behavior and upend both their lives in ways neither could predict. Adrian Buchanan had always believed that his neighbor Mara Sullivan's aggression stemmed from entitlement and stubbornness. Nothing about her behavior suggested deeper complexities, until he stumbled upon a clue that hinted at a darker past. It began innocently enough. One morning, Adrian decided to search public records to learn more about the property lines and historical ownership in his neighborhood. He hoped it might reveal if there was any legal oversight or reason Mara believed she had rights to his pool area. Scrolling through digital archives, he found old land grants, property deeds, and genealogical records referencing the Sullivan family. As he dug deeper, he noticed references to a group called the Malachite Order, a clandestine organization rumored to uphold discriminatory beliefs and practices dating back generations. Adrian's pulse quickened. The name appeared in contexts describing intimidation tactics and even violent incidents in the region's past. The more he searched, the more he discovered. Historical documents showed that Mara's ancestors held influential positions in the Malachite Order, known for pushing an agenda rooted in prejudice. Reports of community intimidation from decades ago included the Sullivan surname. This revelation struck Adrian like a gut punch. He realized Mara's sense of superiority might be tied not just to local property disputes but to a racist ideology that thrived on controlling others. Curiosity turned to unease as he continued reading. Newspaper clippings from the mid-20th century detailed how the Malachite Order had marched through certain neighborhoods, torch in hand, forcing minority residents to flee. References hinted that some branches of the Sullivan clan still revered these hateful traditions as a twisted family legacy. While the specifics weren't entirely clear, Adrian gleaned enough to suspect that Mara might be carrying on an ugly worldview passed down through her lineage. He felt a moral imperative to expose this if it related to her ongoing behavior. Yet, he hesitated. Was it truly relevant to his property conflict? He didn't want to launch a smear campaign without justification. But the possibility that her trespassing and sense of ownership might be fueled by deep-seated prejudice made him shudder. Perhaps she saw him, a relative newcomer, as unworthy of enjoying a home in her territory. Unsure how to proceed, Adrian confided in a friend, Bianca, a local journalist known for investigating social justice issues. Over coffee, he recounted the bizarre property feud and his findings about Mara's ancestry. Bianca listened intently, eyebrows rising at the mention of the Malachite Order. "I've heard rumors," she said. "They claim to be defunct, but stories persist about families who uphold those beliefs in private." Bianca proposed writing an article that connected the historical oppression in Sandpiper Springs to modern-day entitlement. She assured Adrian that she'd approach it with caution, verifying sources carefully. Adrian found himself torn. He valued his privacy but also felt a responsibility to highlight any lingering bigotry. Ultimately, the prospect that Mara's intimidation might be part of a broader pattern of hatred tipped the scales. He gave Bianca permission to use what he'd uncovered, with the caveat that she keep it factual and avoid reckless speculation. As Bianca delved into her research, more disturbing details emerged. Former neighbors of the Sullivan family described an undercurrent of hostility toward anyone they deemed outsiders. One elderly resident recalled how Mara's grandfather once tried to block a black family from moving onto their street, organizing a silent protest with menacing overtones. Another recalled hearing slurs muttered under the family's breath during public gatherings. Bianca methodically pieced these testimonies together, building a narrative that connected the Sullivan family's legacy to the present conflict. Meanwhile, Adrian's tensions with Mara showed no sign of easing. She continued prowling near his fence at odd hours, sometimes rattling the lock or making snide remarks over the hedge. On 2 occasions, the city patrol arrived in response to her melodramatic calls about hostility, only to find no wrongdoing on Adrian's part. The pattern was predictable yet exhausting. Mara lodged false accusations, the patrol investigated, Adrian's security footage absolved him, and Mara faced mild warnings to stop. One evening, after intercepting yet another false complaint from Mara, Adrian decided to share his newest information with the responding officer. He handed over a packet of printouts, old newspaper headlines, references to the Malachite order's ties to the Sullivan family. The officer glanced through them, his expression darkening. "I can't do much with this unless it directly relates to a current crime," he said. "But it's good to know the context. If she escalates further, we'll be aware." Sure enough, Mara didn't relent. As word trickled through the neighborhood that Adrian was researching her family's past, she grew bolder in her confrontations. One afternoon, Adrian caught her screaming at a mutual neighbor about outsiders who don't belong. Another time, she left threatening notes on his porch, calling him a meddler. The environment in Sandpiper Springs grew tense, with neighbors split between those who sympathized with Adrian and those who believed Mara's narrative of being unfairly persecuted. Bianca's article finally reached publication, titled, "Beneath the Palms: How Old Prejudices Linger in Sandpiper Springs." It detailed the historical presence of the Malachite order, linked it to the Sullivan lineage, and offered glimpses of how such beliefs might manifest in modern interactions. Though it never named Mara outright, the implications were unmistakable. It painted a stark picture of bigotry's legacy haunting the present day. Reactions were swift. Social media lit up with debates. Some insisted the Malachite order was ancient history, while others found the parallels chillingly relevant. Adrian braced himself for Mara's response, expecting a firestorm of rage. His only consolation was that the city patrol and local media were now on high alert. If Mara tried to retaliate, she'd have more eyes watching her than ever before. Sure enough, Mara took the article as a personal attack. She confronted Adrian on his driveway, her face livid. "You had no right to dig up my family's past," she spat, voice shaking with anger. "Don't think this makes you righteous." Adrian swallowed hard, standing his ground. "Your actions made me look deeper," he replied. "If you hadn't trespassed and lied repeatedly, none of this would have come to light." Her lips curled into a sneer. "You'll pay for this. I promise." She stormed off, leaving a trail of tension crackling in the air behind her. In the days following, Adrian's security system logged multiple instances of attempted vandalism, trash thrown into the pool, the fence scratched with crude insults. He suspected Mara or her cronies aimed to rattle him further. Yet, ironically, the heightened scrutiny post-article made it easier for the city patrol to investigate. Officers began patrolling the block more frequently, aware that a public spotlight now shone on the situation. Little did Adrian know that Mara's anger was set to erupt into a full-blown confrontation. The stage was already set, her precarious sense of authority threatened, her family's racist legacy laid bare, and her attempts at intimidation on the verge of open violence. Adrian could only hope that if the storm broke, he'd have enough evidence, and enough community support, to weather it unscathed. As tension mounted, Adrian Buchanan found himself in an uneasy standoff. After Bianca's article linked Mara Sullivan's lineage to the malicious Malachite order, Sandpiper Springs erupted in debate. Some residents demanded she apologize for her family's history, while others accused Adrian of digging up dirt just to shame her. Ironically, no one seemed more furious about it than Mara herself. Determined to keep calm, Adrian kept his routines. He'd wake early, swim laps in his secluded pool, and then check his security feeds. He was determined not to let fear drive him from the life he'd built. Still, the memory of Mara's venomous glare lingered, reminding him that she'd promised retribution. He sensed her presence even when she wasn't there, like a storm cloud hovering overhead. One crisp morning, while Adrian was collecting his mail, he noticed a cluster of neighbors gathered near the corner. Whispers of Mara and threats drifted through the air. Approaching them, he learned that she'd gone on a rant during a community meeting the previous night, accusing him of tarnishing her family name and vowing to make him regret it. Those who attended said her vitriol was chilling. Shaken, Adrian retreated to his home, wondering how much worse this could get. He called Bianca, updating her on Mara's latest outburst. Bianca advised him to remain vigilant and document everything. If she crosses a legal line, the journalist said, the authorities can't ignore it, especially now that the spotlight's on her. Sure enough, that line was crossed sooner than expected. On a Saturday afternoon, Adrian stepped out to run errands. Returning, he found an aggressive scrawl painted across his front fence, "We don't forget," in thick red letters. His heart hammered. Clearly, someone was alluding to the Malachite Order's motto. He'd come across that phrase in his research. Anger flared as he realized how far Mara or her supporters were willing to go to intimidate him. He dialed the city patrol immediately. This time, the responding officer was the same one who had warned Mara about trespassing. Examining the graffiti, the officer shook his head. "We can't prove she did it," he said, "but I'll file a report. Keep your cameras rolling." Adrian felt a surge of frustration. The cameras covered his backyard and driveway, but not the front fence. He cursed his oversight. Determined not to fall victim again, he promptly ordered another security camera, one specifically for the front yard. He also hired a local contractor to repaint the fence, ridding himself of the menacing words. While these steps provided temporary relief, the underlying threat loomed larger than ever. Days later, everything escalated. Adrian was in his backyard, tidying up fallen palm fronds, when the side gate slammed open. Mara barged in, her face contorted with rage. "You think you're so clever," she snarled, stepping toward him with fists clenched. "Exposing me, dragging my family's name through the mud, do you have any idea who you're messing with?" Adrian tried to keep his composure, glancing at the security camera perched on a nearby post. "Mara, you're trespassing again. Leave now, or I'll call the city patrol. This is my final warning." Her eyes flicked to the camera, then back to him. "Call them," she spat, voice trembling with hatred. "I'll tell them you threatened me again. Or maybe I'll say you attacked me first. Let's see whose story they believe once and for all." A chill ran down Adrian's spine. Despite her words, he tapped his phone and dialed the emergency line, keeping the device in speaker mode so every word would be recorded. "I'm requesting help," he told the dispatcher. "My neighbor has entered my property illegally. She's confronting me aggressively." He made sure to speak clearly, hoping it'd all be caught on camera and phone audio. Mara lunged, knocking the phone from his hand. It clattered on the pavement, still connected. Stunned, Adrian stumbled back. She raised a hand as if to strike him, but froze when she spotted the blinking camera light. Realizing she was being filmed, she stepped away, her expression wild. "You'll pay for this, you liar," she hissed, turning on her heel and stomping off before the officers arrived. When the city patrol reached Adrian's home, they found him shaken but unharmed. He handed over the phone footage, capturing Mara's threatening behavior, and pointed out the camera that had witnessed the entire scuffle. The officers listened with grim faces. "We'll locate her," they promised, beginning what sounded like an official pursuit. True to their word, they tracked Mara down later that evening. Word spread fast that she'd been arrested. People in the neighborhood whispered about how she'd finally gone too far. Some recounted seeing her hauled off in a squad car, ranting about conspiracies and outsiders. The next day, a local news snippet confirmed Mara's detention on suspicion of assault and false reporting. Several neighbors texted Adrian in relief, offering their support. Yet, for Adrian, the saga was far from over. Amid the swirl of media coverage, fueled by Bianca's prior article and the sensational details of the confrontation, Mara's extended family found themselves under renewed scrutiny. Rumors circulated that some of them were openly defending her actions, claiming she was provoked by an intruder in her own heritage land. Adrian almost laughed at the absurdity. The house was legally his, he'd purchased it fair and square, but they talked like he had stolen it from them. Bianca, seeing the developing story, requested an interview with Adrian to clarify events for the local press. He hesitated, not wanting more attention, but recognized the importance of setting the record straight. Over a carefully arranged phone call, he explained how the conflict began with a simple request for privacy and spiraled into harassment rooted in a racist family tradition. He recounted the crowbar incident, the false police calls, the graffiti, and finally Mara's attempt to physically harm him. Within days, the interview reached local news outlets. Headlines like, "Private Property Dispute or Generational Hatred," dotted social media feeds. Sandpiper Springs residents chimed in with their 2 cents, from outraged condemnation of Mara's behavior to bizarre defenses that accused Adrian of stirring up trouble. The conversations revealed the deep divisions in the community, as well as a willingness by many to stand behind Adrian's right to protect his home. Meanwhile, as Mara awaited her initial court hearing, whispers of further charges loomed. The city patrol had compiled a file of her repeated trespasses, false statements, and attempted assault. Adrian's meticulously saved camera footage was a key piece of evidence. Tension lingered in the air, but for the first time, Adrian sensed a genuine momentum toward a final resolution. He clung to the hope that once the legal system intervened decisively, he might finally live in peace. Still, a kernel of worry nagged him. Mara's arrest wouldn't necessarily erase the hateful legacy tied to her name. If her family was as entrenched in the Malachite order as the record suggested, could others step in to carry on her campaign against him? He tried not to dwell on that possibility. For now, he focused on the upcoming hearing, certain that the mountains of evidence, camera footage, phone recordings, and eyewitness testimony, would be impossible to dismiss. And so, with the swirl of public debate, the media's watchful eye, and the city patrol taking a firm stance, Adrian braced for the next chapter. He hoped it would end in accountability for Mara's actions. If justice prevailed, perhaps he could at last enjoy his pool, untroubled by the footsteps of an uninvited neighbor haunted by a dark family history. While Mara Sullivan sat in detention awaiting her court hearing, the tension in Sandpiper Springs remained palpable. Adrian Buchanan, despite feeling a measure of relief that his most immediate threat was behind bars, discovered that peace was still elusive. Word spread that certain members of Mara's extended family and her old social circle viewed Adrian as a traitor to the neighborhood, an outsider, who'd stirred up trouble by exposing the Sullivan history tied to the Malachite order. Local gossip reached his ears, pointing to vague threats from distant relatives claiming they'd get revenge for Mara's downfall. Though nothing concrete arose, Adrian felt uneasy, as if the presence of danger lurked in the background. Hoping to prepare for any eventualities, he updated his security system once more, adding an additional camera overlooking the front walk. He stored multiple backup copies of each significant recording in both a secure cloud and an external hard drive, building a fortress of evidence in case matters flared again. The day of Mara's preliminary hearing arrived. Adrian, accompanied by a friend for moral support, stood in the modest courthouse among a crowd of curious onlookers. Some recognized him from the local news stories. Whispers of, "That's the homeowner with the pool," drifted in the corridor. He tried to ignore the stares, focusing on the reason he'd come, to ensure Mara faced the consequences of her actions. When the hearing started, Mara appeared escorted by 2 officers, her typically arrogant demeanor replaced with sullen rage. The prosecution outlined her alleged offenses: repeated trespassing, false police reports, attempted property damage, and the most recent assault attempt. Adrian was called to speak, summarizing the months of harassment he'd endured. He mentioned the locked gate she tried to break, the crowbar incident, the fabricated emergency calls, and the final confrontation where she nearly struck him. Mara's defense attorney attempted to paint Adrian as the antagonist, a cunning outsider who orchestrated a smear campaign against her family's legacy. They argued he provoked her by locking her out of land she believed was partially hers. However, the judge seemed unimpressed, especially when prosecutors played security footage showing Mara's crowbar brandishing and her aggressive behavior. Each clip eroded the defense's stance. By the time the hearing concluded, it was clear Mara would be formally charged. With bail set higher than expected, Mara remained in custody. Outside the courthouse, a small group of her supporters confronted Adrian verbally, accusing him of exaggeration and ruining a good family name. He deflected their hostility calmly, repeating that the footage didn't lie. One older woman spat at the ground near his feet, referencing the Malachite Order motto about never forgetting. Officer Keaton, who was on site, quickly intervened, telling them to disperse. Returning home, Adrian felt both victorious and exhausted. While the judicial wheels turned in the right direction, the animosity brewing around him was disconcerting. A few neighbors, once neutral or friendly, now kept their distance. Whether they feared tangling with Mara's extended network or blamed Adrian for the negative publicity that had befallen the area, he couldn't tell. Nonetheless, he resolved to keep a low profile until the trial's conclusion. As weeks stretched on, the local media latched onto every development in the pool dispute case. Bianca's investigative reporting dug deeper into the Malachite Order's shadowy past, unearthing more disturbing details about intimidation tactics from decades prior. She discovered that the Order had, at one point, used the Sullivan property to host clandestine gatherings under the guise of community barbecues. Though law enforcement cracked down on such extremism long ago, the seeds of hatred evidently survived in families like Mara's. Despite the tension, Adrian tried to reclaim a semblance of normal life. On sunny afternoons, he took refreshing swims, always keeping an eye on the gate. He hosted a small barbecue of his own, inviting only close friends. To his relief, no one interrupted or threatened them. Maybe Mara's supporters feared the heightened scrutiny, or maybe they realized further aggression would only strengthen the case against her. Meanwhile, the city patrol performed more frequent drives around the block, courtesy of increased public pressure. Adrian appreciated the show of support, even if he suspected they were motivated by the media spotlight as much as genuine concern. Nonetheless, the presence of marked squad cars helped deter trouble. As the trial date neared, Adrian's anxiety spiked. Subpoenas arrived for him, requiring his testimony in open court. The prosecution coached him on how to present the timeline. From polite requests for Mara to leave, to installing the lock and cameras, to her crowbar incident and false reports, culminating in the culminating assault attempt. They told him the evidence was overwhelming, Mara's case was weak. Yet, she refused any plea deal, insisting she'd been set up. The day of the trial dawned bright and hot, the courthouse abuzz with reporters and local onlookers. Adrian dressed conservatively, trying to steady his nerves. On the ride there, he scrolled through the footage once more on his phone, reminding himself that the facts were indisputable. He just had to stay calm and recount events truthfully. Inside the courtroom, Mara sat at the defense table, her glare fixed on Adrian. He noticed her expression flicker with resentment when the prosecution reintroduced the Malachite Order background. The judge allowed limited context about her family's ties, given its relevance to motive. From Adrian's seat, the tension felt thick enough to cut with a knife. Testimony began with city patrol officers describing multiple calls to Adrian's address, how each time no wrongdoing by Adrian was found. Another officer recounted discovering Mara trying to break into the gate. Adrian himself took the stand, detailing each confrontation with measured composure, referencing exact times and camera recordings. He refused to exaggerate, sticking to the facts in a calm, straightforward manner. The defense attorney attempted to undermine him, suggesting he orchestrated a vendetta. But each time they presented this theory, the prosecution objected, pointing to physical evidence. The crowbar was introduced as a key exhibit, along with forensic proof that Mara's fingerprints covered it. Video clips from the crowbar incident, the police confrontation, and the final assault attempt played on a large monitor for the jury. Finally, Mara testified in her own defense. Her voice quavered, playing the victim card. She claimed Adrian was intimidating her off-camera. She invoked her right to the property due to her family's historic connections. The cross-examination shredded this logic, highlighting the official deeds confirming Adrian's sole ownership. The judge appeared skeptical, especially when confronted with prior warnings the police had given her. After days of testimonies, the closing arguments hammered home the same points. Adrian had acted lawfully to protect his private property. Mara had escalated from mere trespassing to false accusations and attempted assault. The references to the Malachite order lent a disturbing subtext, suggesting bigotry might have fueled her sense of entitlement. It took the jury only a few hours of deliberation before returning a verdict: guilty on charges of making false statements, criminal trespassing, property damage, and attempted assault. The courtroom stirred with gasps and murmurs as the judge pronounced the sentencing date, explaining Mara would remain in custody until then. Adrian felt a whirlwind of emotions: relief, vindication, and sadness that it had come to this. As he exited the courthouse, local reporters clamored for his reaction. He offered a brief statement: "I'm thankful the truth prevailed. This was never about revenge, I just wanted my rights respected." Then he slipped away, eager to avoid further spotlight. Though Mara's final sentencing still lay a few weeks ahead, the immediate threat was effectively neutralized. Adrian hoped that once she faced consequences, the deeper undercurrents of hate tied to her family might lose traction, at least around his home. Yet, a small voice reminded him that prejudice rarely vanished overnight. He could only hope the community recognized that property lines, and basic decency, weren't negotiable, no matter how storied a family's past might be. In the aftermath of the trial, Mara Sullivan awaited sentencing behind bars, while Adrian Buchanan attempted to restore normalcy in his life. The local media, which had eagerly covered every twist in the pool dispute, now pivoted to broader investigations into the Malachite order's lingering influence in Sandpiper Springs. Adrian often woke to headlines discussing other families with rumored ties to the group, each story revealing how these outmoded beliefs still occasionally surfaced in subtle or overt ways. Despite feeling vindicated by the guilty verdict, Adrian couldn't completely shake off the tension that had wrapped around his home like a thick fog. Every time he heard an unfamiliar noise outside, he braced himself, half expecting yet another act of retaliation. But for the moment, Mara's supporters seemed quiet. Perhaps they'd realized the legal repercussions were real, or maybe they were simply regrouping. He found unexpected solace in the kindness of neighbors who reached out privately to express sympathy. Some admitted they'd known about the Sullivan family's intimidating tendencies but were too scared or apathetic to take a stand. A few even shared personal stories of smaller disputes with Mara, telling Adrian he was brave for confronting her. These messages buoyed his spirits, offering a reminder that not everyone sided with Mara's toxic worldview. Meanwhile, the city patrol maintained a steady presence around Sandpiper Springs. Officer Keaton swung by Adrian's home a few times, offering a friendly nod and checking if he had any concerns. While the entire ordeal had begun with Adrian feeling like the police didn't take him seriously enough, that perception changed after Mara's repeated false calls and eventual arrest. Now, the police seemed keen to ensure the final sentencing proceeded without disruption. A twist came when Adrian received a phone call from Thomas Sloan, an investigative journalist from a larger regional paper. Sloan explained he was expanding on Bianca's earlier coverage, delving deeper into the Malachite order's modern manifestations. He believed the Sullivan family's stance, and Mara's meltdown, could shed light on how old prejudices lingered in daily life. At first, Adrian hesitated. He'd had his fill of media attention. But Sloan assured him the piece would also highlight how communities could stand against hate. Reluctantly, Adrian agreed to share his perspective, hoping it might discourage others from similar behavior. During their interview, Sloan asked pointed questions about how it felt to learn of Mara's racist family ties. Adrian admitted that it explained the ferocity of her entitlement, tying it to a generational belief that certain people didn't deserve property in this neighborhood. He recounted how disturbing it was to realize his personal conflict might be rooted in deeper bigotry, not just a property boundary squabble. After the interview, he felt a strange mix of catharsis and trepidation. As sentencing day approached, the buzz around the courthouse reignited. Locals wondered if Mara would show remorse. Some speculated she'd blame everything on her upbringing and promise to rehabilitate. Others predicted she'd remain defiant, doubling down on her warped sense of ownership. Adrian tried not to dwell on it. He simply wanted closure. On the day of the hearing, Adrian arrived early, flanked by supportive friends. The atmosphere inside the courtroom was subdued yet tense. Mara entered, her posture rigid, eyes darting around as though scanning for sympathizers. She wore a plain outfit, far removed from the confident figure who once broke into Adrian's yard. The judge wasted little time, summarizing the case and inviting final statements. Mara's defense attorney spoke first. Attempting to frame her as a product of a troubled environment, they highlighted her family's backward beliefs as an unfortunate inheritance. They asked for leniency, arguing Mara could reform with counseling. Yet, when Mara addressed the court herself, she unleashed a bitter tirade. She railed against outsiders, insisted Adrian was no saint, and labeled the Malachite order's legacy as honorable traditions. Her defiance hung in the air, undercutting her attorney's plea for leniency. Adrian glanced around, noticing shock on the faces of some attendees. Even those who'd harbored sympathy for Mara seemed taken aback by her unapologetic stance. The prosecution, in turn, urged the judge to see that her behavior posed a threat to the community's safety. They cited her history of ignoring court orders, her attempts to break into Adrian's property, her repeated lies, and the final assault attempt. When the judge issued the sentence, 1 year in county jail, a hush fell over the room. Mara stiffened, and a guttural snarl escaped her lips. She rounded on Adrian, about to hurl more accusations, but officers quickly subdued her. The judge demanded order, and Mara was ushered away, leaving behind a trail of stunned silence. Outside the courthouse, a throng of reporters pounced on Adrian for comments. Flashing cameras and microphones pressed him for a statement. He offered a short reply: "I respect the court's decision. I hope this resolution helps our community move forward." Then, he slipped away, avoiding a protracted media circus. In the days that followed, news of Mara's sentencing dominated local headlines. While some voiced outrage, many expressed relief that her brand of hostility and entitlement had consequences. Social media erupted with discussions about how quickly lines between prejudice and personal dispute could blur. Some even credited Adrian for standing firm and exposing a malignant undercurrent in Sandpiper Springs. On the other hand, certain fringe groups rallied around Mara's cause, claiming she was a martyr for traditional values, though they struggled to gain mainstream traction. With Mara behind bars, Adrian experienced a new sense of calm. He no longer jumped at every late-night sound or dreaded stepping into his yard. He even mustered the courage to repaint the exterior of his fence in a bold, fresh color, a symbolic move to reclaim what felt tainted by the scrawled threats. Friends congratulated him on finally having the freedom to enjoy his property as intended. Behind the scenes, though, Adrian nursed lingering wounds. The emotional toll of the conflict. Nights of disrupted sleep, the constant vigilance, the public scrutiny, didn't vanish overnight. He considered therapy to process the ordeal. He also planned to speak at a local community forum about the importance of standing up for one's rights without succumbing to bitterness. Bianca encouraged him to share his story more widely, convinced it could inspire others facing harassment or bigotry. Meanwhile, the final chapters of the Malachite order's influence in the Sullivan family might not be fully closed. Rumors persisted about scattered members still living in nearby counties, holding on to archaic doctrines. Adrian tried not to dwell on it. As far as he was concerned, the law had intervened, and he hoped that spelled the end of trouble at his doorstep. For now, he reveled in the simple joys he'd once taken for granted: an uninterrupted afternoon swim, a quiet sunset spent reading by the pool, a chat with friendly neighbors who'd come to support him. Each moment felt like a triumph, a reminder that hateful legacies need not dominate the present. In the hush of a Sandpiper Springs evening, with the reflection of palm trees dancing on the pool's surface, Adrian allowed himself a smile. Maybe, just maybe, normalcy was within reach. Adrian Buchanan savored the days that followed Mara Sullivan's sentencing. In the hush that fell upon Sandpiper Springs, his home at last felt like the sanctuary he'd yearned for. No more frantic knocks at his gate, no more trash strewn about his pool, no more menacing notes. Though a faint unease lingered, he allowed himself to breathe freely, focusing on restoring his mental well-being and forging better connections with neighbors who'd offer genuine warmth. With Mara behind bars, local gossip shifted focus. Some corners of the community insisted the conflict was overblown, while others pointed to it as a teaching moment about prejudice. A wave of civic engagement blossomed. The Homeowners Association organized an open forum on neighbors' rights and responsibilities, inviting experts to discuss property law and conflict resolution. Adrian was asked to speak, but he demurred, preferring to ease out of the spotlight. Meanwhile, Thomas Sloan, the regional journalist who'd interviewed Adrian, continued investigating the Malachite Order's remnants. His in-depth report exposed how pockets of this group occasionally tried to exert influence in subtle ways, blocking certain families from renting or buying in particular neighborhoods, spreading rumors to sabotage outsiders, and so on. Sandpiper Springs featured heavily as a prime example of how these beliefs persisted in modern communities. Adrian was grateful the article shone light on the bigger picture, revealing that Mara's actions weren't isolated but rooted in a broader, festering ideology. Though the animosity abated, it hadn't vanished entirely. Adrian occasionally heard that members of Mara's extended family were still stewing, convinced she'd been wronged. He caught murmurs of a possible appeal, though legal analysts predicted it would fail, given the sheer weight of evidence. Adrian fortified his property one more time with additional lighting along the side yards. He doubted anyone would escalate now that the legal system had intervened so decisively, but he refused to be complacent. One Saturday morning, as he lounged on a deck chair by the pool, a neighbor named Oscar Powell dropped by with a plate of homemade cookies. Oscar apologized that he'd remained distant during the conflict, explaining he once had a minor run-in with Mara and feared retribution. "I'm sorry for not speaking up," Oscar confessed, "but I want to show my support now." Adrian thanked him, touched by the gesture. They chatted about random topics: home repairs, Oscar's new dog, the changing vibes of Sandpiper Springs. It was a light, friendly conversation that Adrian had sorely missed during the turmoil. As Oscar left, Adrian felt a comforting sense of community returning. Perhaps he wasn't alone in wanting a kinder environment free from intimidation. Later that day, Adrian strolled through the neighborhood to pick up groceries. Passing Mara's now vacant property gave him an odd sense of melancholy, despite everything she'd done. The house looked unkempt, with weeds sprouting in the front yard and a neglected mailbox overflowing with junk mail. He pondered how a place once brimming with the arrogance of its occupant now seemed abandoned, an apt metaphor for how swiftly illusions of power can crumble. As the weeks rolled on, the local court finalized Mara's punishment, a full year in county jail, plus mandatory counseling upon release. A small wave of public backlash ensued. Some believed the sentence was too harsh, others deemed it too lenient. Adrian steered clear of these debates. He'd given statements, shared evidence, and let the judicial process play out. He was done fighting for moral high ground, he just wanted to live. An unexpected invitation arrived in Adrian's mailbox one evening, a note from the Homeowners Association, requesting his attendance at a special banquet honoring courageous community members. At first, he felt conflicted: had he truly displayed courage, or just basic self-defense? But friends insisted his stance against harassment and bigotry made a difference in the neighborhood. Reluctantly, he decided to attend. The banquet took place in the local civic center, a modest venue with a small stage and rows of fold-out chairs. A crowd milled about, sipping lemonade and chatting softly. Adrian recognized some faces, the neighbors who'd rallied around him, the city patrol officers who responded to his calls, and even a few who'd previously remained neutral. Bianca was there, too, smiling brightly when she spotted him. When Adrian's name was announced, he shuffled forward, feeling every eye on him. The HOA chairperson praised his perseverance in the face of intimidation, citing how his resolve and evidence collection led to a fair legal outcome. Accepting a simple plaque with trembling hands, he mustered a quick speech, "Thank you. I hope we can use this experience to treat each other with respect and honesty, even when we disagree." Polite applause followed, and he returned to his seat, relieved the spotlight was fleeting. After the ceremony, attendees approached him with a flurry of congratulations and relief that the ordeal was behind them. Some quietly mentioned their own brushes with prejudice or intimidation, reinforcing the idea that Adrian's ordeal resonated far beyond a single property line dispute. He found himself exchanging numbers with strangers who wanted to keep in touch in case they needed moral or legal support down the road. Meanwhile, the vacuum left by Mara's absence led to speculation about her property's future. Rumors circulated that her extended family might attempt to manage it or sell it off. A real estate agent's sign eventually sprouted on the lawn, fueling talk that the Sullivans intended to cut ties with Sandpiper Springs altogether. Adrian felt a twinge of relief. If they sold the house, perhaps no one with Malachite order ties would remain next door. He crossed his fingers for a decent, drama-free neighbor to move in. On an unassuming Thursday afternoon, Bianca stopped by for a chat. She'd uncovered new leads about the Malachite order's diminishing presence in the area. "Your case," she said, helped galvanize local authorities to track down other families still engaging in covert intimidation tactics. She added that several investigations were ongoing, hinting that justice might be served on a broader scale than just Mara's sentencing. Adrian absorbed the news with cautious optimism. It felt surreal that his simple desire for a private pool had snowballed into a catalyst for confronting a dormant hateful network. Though the process was draining, he couldn't deny some satisfaction in knowing good might come from his ordeal. As the sun dipped below palm trees that evening, Adrian found himself perched on the edge of his pool, feet dangling in the water. The air was still, the reflection of the twilight sky dancing on the gentle ripples. For once, no swirl of dread or adrenaline coursed through him. Instead, he allowed peace to wash over him, savoring the quiet. He suspected challenges might still lurk beyond the horizon, Mara's eventual return, possible retribution from her clan, or even unrelated trials life could throw at him. But for now, he chose to trust in the strength he discovered within himself and the supportive community emerging around him. Stepping inside, he locked up for the night, not out of fear but habit. He felt no pressing compulsion to double-check every bolt or glance anxiously at the camera feeds. In that moment, the home he'd purchased, the same one that had become a battleground, finally felt like the tranquil haven he'd envisioned all along. And he intended to keep it that way, no matter what ghosts of intolerance lingered in the region's shadows. The long-standing turmoil that once engulfed Adrian Buchanan's life had at last receded, replaced by a calm that felt almost foreign. Mara Sullivan remained in jail, serving her sentence, and Sandpiper Springs gradually shifted its attention to new concerns, local elections, a proposed park renovation, and the ongoing conversation about eradicating the Malachite order's lingering influence. Despite occasional rumors of resentment simmering among Mara's distant relatives, no actual threats materialized. Adrian's daily routine returned to a version of normalcy he'd nearly forgotten. He spent his weekends tinkering with minor home improvements, painting the living room, upgrading the outdoor lighting, and adding extra plants around the pool for a lush, tropical vibe. Each task felt like a declaration of ownership, an affirmation that he no longer feared trespassers or damaging altercations. For the first time in months, he could step onto his deck without scanning the perimeter for signs of intrusion. Nevertheless, the mental scars lingered. Friends noticed Adrian occasionally twitch at sudden noises or glance at his phone whenever it buzzed, half expecting a security alert. His neighbor Oscar offered quiet understanding, suggesting therapy could help. Adrian mulled the idea, recognizing how the tension still clung to him like an unwelcome shadow. In the end, he booked a few sessions, hoping to process the conflict that had consumed him. While he focused on healing, the community kept evolving. A newly appointed advisory board formed under the Homeowners Association, tasked with drafting guidelines for property disputes. Their mission was to prevent future incidents like Adrian's from spiraling out of control. When asked to weigh in, Adrian politely submitted written suggestions, emphasizing the importance of clear legal backing, thorough documentation, and prompt police intervention. He avoided public speaking, preferring to let his experiences speak for themselves. During this period, Bianca's investigative articles gained traction beyond Sandpiper Springs. She wrote follow-up pieces highlighting how communities could tackle hidden bigotry by supporting targeted residents and holding aggressors accountable. National media outlets occasionally referenced Adrian's ordeal in broader discussions on property rights and modern-day racism. Adrian felt a mix of pride and discomfort seeing his experiences shape these narratives. He valued progress but resented being a public example. Meanwhile, Mara's house next door remained unoccupied, a silent reminder of her downfall. The yard became increasingly unkempt, though a "for sale" sign hinted at eventual change. Adrian occasionally caught glimpses of potential buyers touring the property under the supervision of a wary real estate agent. Part of him prayed a kind, respectful person would purchase it, someone who valued neighborly goodwill over archaic entitlements. One late afternoon, the agent knocked on Adrian's door, explaining she had serious prospects interested and wanted assurance about the pool situation. Adrian, a bit amused, clarified that the pool was entirely on his land, with high hedges marking the boundary. He offered to show them the fence line. The agent seemed relieved, likely aware of the local lore surrounding the infamous pool feud. She thanked him for his cooperation, remarking that the prospective buyers appreciated clarity on neighborhood dynamics. Later, as twilight settled, Adrian found himself reflecting on how far he'd come. Not too long ago, he dreaded stepping outside, anticipating each day might bring a new confrontation. Now, he relaxed in the gentle evening breeze, gazing at the swaying palms and the shimmering water. A wave of gratitude washed over him, gratitude for the neighbors who'd supported him, for Bianca's reporting, for the city patrol's eventual diligence, and for the justice system that upheld his rights. Of course, a sliver of caution remained. Mara's release date loomed months away, and her extended family still lived in the region. But Adrian felt prepared. The locks, cameras, and supportive community formed a protective shield. Even if old prejudices flared up, he knew he wouldn't face them alone. He turned in for the night with a heart slightly lighter. The quiet hum of crickets lulled him to sleep, no jolts of anxiety rousing him from bed. As the final vestiges of tension ebbed away, Adrian realized that, for the first time in what felt like ages, he was genuinely at peace in his own home, a sense of victory that no malicious neighbor or ancient hate group could ever take from him. A few months later, as Mara Sullivan's release date approached, the specter of her return stirred whispers around Sandpiper Springs. Yet, by this point, Adrian Buchanan had achieved a level of tranquility that felt unassailable. In counseling sessions, he'd worked through the fear and anger that once gripped him, emerging with a renewed conviction: whatever happened next, he would no longer live as a captive of anxiety. His property remained fortified by discreet security measures, cameras, locks, and sensors. Still, Adrian found himself less reliant on checking them constantly. Time and a supportive community had softened his reflexes. He trusted that any reappearance of aggression would be swiftly met with both documentation and neighborly outrage. Meanwhile, the vacant Sullivan house had finally sold to a retired couple who spent their days gardening and waving cheerily across the fence. Adrian had introduced himself to them, relieved to see no trace of hostility in their eyes. In early spring, rumors trickled in that Mara would be moving to a different county upon release, possibly to stay with distant relatives. Adrian exhaled, sensing this might be the concluding chapter. And so it was. On the day Mara left the county jail, she vanished from Sandpiper Springs without fanfare. No social media tirade, no farewell screed. Just the echo of a heated saga that once rattled the neighborhood. Though her presence disappeared physically, the lessons she forced the community to confront lingered. Sandpiper Springs collectively recognized how generational hatred, like that championed by the Malachite order, could resurface in mundane disputes. More than a few neighbors vowed never again to stay silent if they saw subtle forms of bias or intimidation. The new Homeowners Association guidelines, inspired by Adrian's ordeal, became a local blueprint for handling property conflicts with clarity and unity. Adrian found a quiet sense of fulfillment watching these changes unfold. He participated in a local panel, this time willingly, where property owners discussed best practices for boundary respect, documenting harassment, and the significance of standing up to bullies. Bianca moderated the session, ensuring it stayed focused on constructive dialogue rather than sensationalizing the past. Adrian spoke plainly, recounting how a single pool had become a flashpoint for something far deeper. Attendees listened raptly, some teary-eyed at the mention of bigotry's lingering scars. After the panel, people approached him with heartfelt thanks. A single mother admitted she once feared reporting a hostile neighbor but now felt empowered. An older man, who recalled darker times in Sandpiper Springs, praised Adrian for exposing the Malachite order's remnants. Their words underscored how his personal struggle had prompted a communal reckoning. He realized his story was no longer just about a gate lock or a camera, it was about sparking a broader vigilance against hatred. Shortly thereafter, Bianca published a final retrospective piece titled, "When Hatred Knocks, How One Homeowner Turned the Tide in Sandpiper Springs." Though Adrian cringed at seeing his name in headlines again, he appreciated her thoughtful narrative. She highlighted not only the resolution of his property dispute but also the cultural shift that followed. The piece ended on a hopeful note, underscoring how adversity could galvanize a neighborhood to stand for principle and decency. One late afternoon, as the Florida sun cast long shadows across the yard, Adrian relaxed in his pool chair. With a gentle breeze rustling the palm trees, he sipped homemade lemonade, finally tasting the peace he'd worked so hard to protect. There was no uneasy glance over his shoulder, no anxious thrill at the sound of a twig snapping. The water in his private lagoon-like pool glistened calmly, free from the turmoil that once polluted it. He couldn't forget the ordeal completely, nor would he want to, for it had shaped him. He'd learned the value of unwavering truth, of capturing evidence, and of forging alliances within the community. He understood how prejudice festers if left unchecked, and how shining light on it can uproot old, stubborn weeds. In that sense, he wore the memories as a badge of survival, not resentment. Staring at the reflection of the turquoise water, Adrian felt a sense of closure. The conflict with Mara Sullivan, the looming threat of the Malachite order's ideology, the stress of near-constant vigilance, all had receded into the background of a life that once again felt authentically his. He planned to continue building positive connections with his neighbors, forging a Sandpiper Springs defined by cooperation rather than division. With the last rays of sunlight dancing across the ripples, Adrian stood and stretched. He shut off the pool lights, locked the gate behind him, and walked inside, heart content. The home he saved for and cherished now stood as a beacon of his personal victory, a victory not just over an intrusive neighbor, but over the deeper forces of intolerance and hatred. And as the evening hush enveloped him, he knew that no matter what future storms might brew, he'd face them head-on, resolute in defending the peace he'd finally attained.